Good evening. Tonight's guests are Ed Cox and George Marlin. Ed Cox is a corporate lawyer with Patterson Belknap. He has served as a SUNY trustee since 1995, as chairman of the New York League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, as commissioner of the New York Commission on Judicial Nominations, and as chairman of the State Parks Council. Ed is also one of the founding members of New Yorkers for Growth, an organization concerned about New York's excessive income and property taxes. Ed resides in Long Island and New York City with his family. George Marlin is a noted author who often writes for the New York Post, Newsday, and the New York Times. George has served as the CEO of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, has run for mayor of New York City, and is president of the Philadelphia Trust Company. George resides with his wife in Long Island. My co-host tonight is Mike Mulhall.
Thank you, Frank.
Thank you both.
Good to be here.
Happy to be here.
My first question, I'll pose this to you, Ed, is New York is facing, the state of New York is facing what appears to be the greatest fiscal crisis in the state's history, having to close a looming deficit of over $50 billion, it's estimated, in the next several years. At the same time, New York also has the highest set of income, sales, and property taxes in the nation. What do you believe are the key factors contributing to the fiscal crisis in the state of New York today?
Well, you're absolutely right. At the moment the budget got balanced because of the stimulus funds that permitted it to get balanced, when those run off in 2 years, you're going to have a $25 billion a year deficit going out annually, as far as the eye can see. So what contributed to it is just over a long period of time, the Medicaid program has gotten bloated. It is you take a look at what that costs. While we have about half the population of California and Florida combined, our Medicaid costs are much more than those two states combined. There's a lot of fraud and abuse in that. You can go to the not just what is paid to our bloated bureaucracies in Albany and in our municipalities, but you can also look at the pension costs that are out there that are not part of the annual deficit that we're going to have to face down the line. These are huge problems, and they have to be addressed now, and they're not being addressed in an honest way.
George, your thoughts?
Ed's fundamentally right. To put it in perspective, during the Cuomo years, spending was 1.8 times the inflation rate. During the Pataki years, spending was 2.49 the inflation rate, 2.5 times the inflation rate. Mario Cuomo is starting to look like a fiscal conservative. Okay. During the Spitzer-Patterson years, spending has been about 6 times the inflation rate. You cannot have a consistently spending program outside inflation because sooner or later there's going to be a day of reckoning. And
but let's be fair, at multiples of inflation.
Multiples of inflation, yes. So we're talking average over the last 20 some odd years, probably about 4 times the inflation rate if you put it all together. Spitzer's first budget was 10 times the inflation rate. How crazy is that? Okay, you cannot do this forever and have a tax base that is getting narrower and narrower. For instance, upstate New York right now, we've seen in the last 7 years 1.5 million people move out of the state of New York, 1 million from upstate New York. Suburban Catholics, rural Republican Protestants moved out of the state. Right now, north of Orange County, 50% of the jobs in upstate New York are financed by the state government. Either you're working for a school district, you're working for a jailhouse, or you're working for the medical community, which is 100% financed by us taxpayers. So you cannot have this kind of economy that is going on and expect it to sustain. We depended 20% of the revenue of the state of New York from Wall Street. It's not happening anymore. So the hole is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every year. He's right when you say the stimulus is the one shot, but when that one shot goes away, there's going to be a huge hole, and just by expanding taxes, it just can't work. It's a treadmill to oblivion.
And here's a political tragedy. Spitzer got elected governor with, what, 60% of the vote, 65% of the vote?
Almost 70% of the vote, 69% of the vote.
And his first budget increased was 7% over the prior year's budget. And of course, the legislature then upped that to 9%. George Pataki was elected, I believe, George checked me, 49% of the vote. Mm-hmm. And yet, in his first year, thanks to John Faso and Patty Woodworth, the head of his budget unit, cut $10 billion out of the budget, cut taxes $5 billion, and closed the $5 billion gap. With the right political will, you can start working at the problem. But at the moment, Albany doesn't have that political will.
Well, and it comes upon, I think, one of the factors that's another issue within the state of New York is school education. New York State is always the first or second highest spending state in the nation in terms of dollars per pupil and in the nation. Yet our educational test scores, the results, are always somewhere in the middle. What could we do, if anything, to improve educational quality and address educational costs at the same time?
Well, first of all, the expense, as you say, that's accurate. It's completely out of control, and we don't see the bang for the buck. Charter schools, parochial schools prove all the time. The average Catholic school survives on about $4,000 to $5,000 per pupil, and their statistics in terms of educational results are far superior. The point being is that money does not necessarily equal a better education. We prove that all the time. However, Albany plays to the tune of the unions. There are two groups of people who control Albany. One are unions, the second are lobbyists. And everybody is consumed about fearing what the unions may do to them, so they roll over dead. This is bipartisan institutional corruption. Republicans and Democrats fall for it all the time. The Republicans lost control of the state Senate because they used the same model to try to get elected as Democrats. Buy off the teachers, buy off the healthcare union, and everybody will love us. Well, they failed because they lied. Yes, so long as you're in the majority, we love you. When you're in a minority, we don't care anymore. So you have the teachers who control Albany. The Albany dances to their tune. They get away with everything they want. In the meantime, we see expenses just jumping through the roof, and people are beginning to vote with their feet. They are leaving the state of New York. So the tax base is getting smaller all the time, which means it's a greater burden for those people that are left behind. A house in Scolari County that was worth $136,000, the taxes on that was $6,000 last year, the school taxes. The average income in Scolari County is $28,000. I live in the town of North Hempstead. Frank and I live in the town of North Hempstead. The average income in town of North Hempstead is $110,000. Okay, the average, a $750,000 house, property taxes $12,000. I think it's an outrage, but upstate New York, because of a shrinking tax base, they're going broke. The county executive, Monroe County, she will tell you that 82% of her budget is unfunded state mandates. She only controls 18% of the budget. You go down to look at a school district, because of what Albany demands and what the teachers' unions get away with, it's the same theory. Increasing taxes on a declining tax base. So what is the answer to it? Okay, we could argue, I'm sure we'll talk about charter schools and a host of other things here, caps on the property tax, et cetera, et cetera. What we've been hearing for years, it requires what Ed said a few minutes ago, political will in Albany. Until we throw out the bums, it's not going to change.
Now, Ed, I know you're eager to answer this, but I would add just one additional context. It is possible in the past decades that this was supported by a much more robust economy in the state of New York. As George alluded to, the spring of wealth that comes from Wall Street, that is obviously gone now in our current economy and is likely to stay subdued for the coming years. And in the context of that, your thoughts?
Well, let me, there are basic structural problems in the way our public school system works. And in 1985, one of the great conservatives here in New York State, Peter Flanagan, asked me to join with him in founding an organization called the Student Sponsor Partners. This was in response to President Reagan's commission that put out a report called A Nation at Risk, and less particularly with respect to our inner city kids. And the organization, Peter's concept was that the parochial schools have empty seats, and yet they perform better than the regular public school system. So we got people from Wall Street to mentor and pay for kids. We took the average. We didn't take the cream. We took the average inner city kid and put them in the parochial high school when the kids are most at risk, put them in the parochial school. And Rand did a study on us, Paul Hill at Rand, and the study showed that the parochial schools did twice the job for half the cost. The public schools, 20-30% chance of graduating. Parochial schools, 70-80% chance of graduating, and 90% of those went on to college. Now, why was this? It's because they didn't have this huge bureaucracy over them. The principal of that parochial school was there all the time. The father, or whoever it was, the Monsignor was running that school. And he said, I care about you. I'm going to make sure that you graduate and get on to college. What a message for the kids. And right down through that school, they operate as an efficient educational and also, frankly, moral, teaching basic principles, what kids should do. It was a good unit of learning. Mayoralty control has wiped away part of that bureaucracy. It still has a long way to go, and that's why the inner city schools are doing better, because we now have mayoralty control. We don't have a school board that is run politically and where the bureaucracy tells the principals what to do, and the principals are always looking, well, how do we follow the rules, rather than how do we teach the kids in the classroom. I have, since 1999, been in charge of State University's charter school program. I put together the program after Governor Pataki got his law passed in that famous December 98 back and forth with the legislature, where he said, if you want your raise, you give me my charter school bill. It's a pretty good bill. And charter schools have proved the same thing. Since they are not run by the rules, because they're exempt from all the rules except for anti-discrimination, health and safety, and also testing rules. They have to go by those. Otherwise, they're exempt from all the state and local rules. They have shown also that a site-based management where the principal runs the show does much better than the public school system. And that's why you're finding charter schools are spreading throughout the country, and that concept is being adopted by city school systems, and that's what we need to do, is and you'll get a better schools for less cost if you follow those principles.
And to just build on that for a second, the Archdiocese of New York, which runs parochial schools in 10 counties. Dr. Hickey runs the Chancellor of Education. She has 40 bureaucrats that work for her, 40, okay, running hundreds of schools throughout the Archdiocese. City of New York
The
has
numbers I've
thousands of
seen,
thousands.
George, recently, I was doing some research, there's approximately 400,000 children receiving a private school education courtesy of the Catholic school system. And the Catholic school system,
That's the
because
state of New York?
State of New York, and because the cost associated with educating a child in Catholic school is less than the average at the New York State level, the savings to the New York State taxpayers annually, whether they're Catholic or not,
Oh,
irrespective,
that's true.
is somewhere
That's
between
absolutely
$7
true.
and $9 billion.
If they closed all the schools tomorrow.
Correct. And the issues that both you and Ed are highlighting today for our viewers is that in a weaker economy, people are less likely to be able to support that Catholic school system, and thus, should it decline or even collapse, the burden for the state taxpayers is going to grow larger by almost $10 billion.
Actually, there's a very interesting story about a researcher, one of the well-known researchers about public school education, called this was way back in the 90s, called the city bureaucracy and said, now, how many administrators do you have? And they said, well, wait, we'll get back to you, and they didn't. So he called them again, how many do you have? And he kept persisting, and finally, after 6 months, he gets a number 7,000, whatever. 4 million kids, basically, in the public school system. So then he calls the parochial school, he calls Hickey's office. And yeah, how many do you have? And she said, well, I'll have to get back to you. And he said, oh no, here we go again. He said, no, just wait a second, hold on the phone, I gotta count them. 34.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a
And they have
famous story.
100,000, so they have 1/10 of students with, and 7,000 administrators back then versus 34. That's why the Catholic schools did twice the job for half the cost.
And it's interesting to note, of all the charter schools that have started, the only one that is doing extremely poorly is the UFT's charter school, okay? Because they implemented all the bureaucratic baloney they did in the public school system. So they wanted one, they got one, and it's doing poorly compared to the other charter
Well,
schools.
Let me get into some other. You've made an excellent point, both of you, about how people are leaving New York State. 5 of my 7 children have left New York State. They're down in the Virginia area. Most of my 28 grandkids down in Virginia. It's very sad. It's a very depressing thing.
I have 6 first cousins. I'm the only one
Left.
that's still here.
And this is the trend. As George mentioned, he quoted numbers. I've seen these studies. We're losing more people in absolute numbers than any state in the nation. Percentage-wise, right after Rhode Island, I think we're the second highest. So people are leaving the state. Businesses are leaving. As you said, the upstate situation is disastrous economically. The 2 areas that pose the bulk of our budget are health and education. Those are the biggest part, 2/3 or more of our total state budget. On education, let me just focus on that, what you've been talking about. There have been a lot of proposals, they don't seem to be going anyplace in New York State, to give parents choice in education. Across the nation, there are about a dozen school choice programs, not only charter schools, but tax credits or scholarships. In New York, the most powerful union, is, I think George said, is the NYSUT, New York State United Teachers. They strongly oppose any parental choice in education because they want to keep their educational monopoly. Every proposal that's been enacted, every study that's been done shows this, sets up vouchers or scholarships for parents to choose their child's school at less than half the cost of a public school cost. So in New York State, we're at 15, 16,000. Long Island, we're at 20,000. Every scholarship program or tax credit program sets it at 5, 6,000, a quarter or a third of the cost. So taxpayers clearly would win. What is your view on the amount of the savings? Are you familiar with any studies done on the amount of the savings? I know there was a study done in '91 by Ron Lauder for the New York State Senate. $4 billion was the estimated savings back then. I don't know what it is now. And what about quality? If parents get to choose, and today it's primarily the minority parents who are suffering. I mean, they're the ones who are being really calamitously hurt by the public schools. The wealthier people move out of the city schools and so forth, move to a more affluent neighborhood. But what do you think? What are the chances that our politicians will ever be able to stand up to the Public School Teachers Union and give parents choice? And what do you think the fiscal and educational impact would be on our students? I'll start with you, Ed.
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, we need opportunity scholarships, so we need to have tax credits for parents who want to have school choice. And there's no doubt that school choice is now getting tremendous momentum. And it's starting in the charter school movement, which is giving school choice. I recently was up in Harlem in the Harlem Armory. There were 5,000 kids in the Armory with their parents screaming and shouting for school choice. They want school choice. Not one of the Harlem Democratic leaders showed up there. Now, to their credit, Governor Patterson has been out there working for charter schools going way back, and so has Malcolm Smith. I was with them at the opening of charter schools, and they're standing firm for them. As you have assaults on charter schools, which do give school choice to parents in inner city neighborhoods. The teachers unions, others have tried to undermine charter schools, but Malcolm and David have stood strong for them. So you have to give them that credit. Plus, you've got people like Calvin Butts and Floyd Flake who are out there right at the start realizing school choice is the way to go.
There are many black
So we
leaders
have to work
doing it.
through the charter schools to the opportunity scholarships to the tax credits.
What about now the typical African-American voter and Hispanic voter? 90%, 95% vote Democratic. They automatically vote Democratic. Yet the black parent, the Hispanic parent, more than the white parent, every poll shows this, wants parental choice in education because they know their kids are getting screwed, they are in failing schools, and they don't want reverse discrimination. They don't want this race preferences.
They just want their kids to get a good education. It's very straightforward.
Right. Affirmative action where you make, not where you get preferences, but where you have a decent chance, a fair chance of getting a job. But yet, why are the African Americans and Hispanics, they're still voting for the Democratic politicians who oppose giving their parents choice? Why?
That is one of the ironies.
What is the explanation?
That's one of the ironies.
George?
It is what it is, okay, and it's not going to change. All right, first of all, this is becoming a one-party state, and where the action will be down the road will be in the primaries. And so if people get angry enough, and I think, I'm of the personal opinion, getting a sense now, and I've been writing a lot about this recently, there is a tax revolt brewing in this state. They cannot push this envelope much further. And that may be where the real battles in the Democratic primary. I happen to think a Republican conservative get elected governor because of the fiscal mess. We've seen it in other blue states. It's happened before, and I think it could happen again. First, we need a Republican Party that has a team of people who are willing to stand up to the plate and run for public office.
Any chance of that happening, though?
At the moment, it's rather dreary. Okay, everyone's sitting around, and what is Rudy Giuliani going to do? What's his temperature today? I don't think Rudy Giuliani is going to run, but I don't think you sit around and give him 6 months to decide. Say, if you're running, run. Takes a year and a half to build an organization. Say, if not, get out of the way and let some other people decide what they should do. I happen to think Peter King should run for governor of the state of New York. Peter, runs in a district where he gets along with Democrats, Republicans, and can be governor of the state of New York. I've told him that publicly.
I agree.
Forget the U.S. Senate, run for governor of the state of New York.
What about the New York Senators, though? How do you judge their performance?
Well, the performance thing, because they used a Democratic light model, thinking that will hold on to power, and it failed. And if they do not reclaim the Senate back in 2 years, I think they have a half a shot at it. I think Foley on Eastern Long Island is vulnerable. They could pick up a seat upstate. If they don't get it back, it's over, because the lines will be recut, and it will be recut that you'll go down to about 20 Republican state senators. And so they will be in the minority forever, just as the Republican Assembly is in the minority forever. They don't even have a veto power anymore, because they're under 1/3 of the New York State Assembly. The state's getting bluer and bluer. Republicans, in many ways, brought it on themselves. So all the programs you're talking about, we're all very supportive of it. Is it going to happen in Albany? I hate to be the negative, the gloomy Gus here. No, because the teachers' unions will give David Patterson and Malcolm Smith a pass on the issue, so long as it doesn't matter.
Right.
Their vote and their rhetoric, just that rhetoric, doesn't matter. If push came to shove, and it was a deciding vote of Malcolm Smith or David Patterson
Then
with
they'd
a
be
pen,
held responsible.
then they'd be
Yeah.
all over.
Right.
Okay, so sometimes you get passes because it just doesn't matter. And David Patterson's rhetoric and actions are two different things. He learned from George Pataki to govern by press release, and that's what he's doing at the moment.
I disagree with George. I don't think a taxpayers' revolt is brewing. I think it's here, it's now, and it is there, except we don't have initiative like they have in California where it can take off. So if the Republican Party taps into that, it can take that energy that is there right now. The revolt's going on. It just needs a political channel. And if the party defines itself in the right way as a party of principle on these issues, and you have a person like Congressman King running as our candidate, we've got a good chance of taking the governorship, regardless of who is running on the other side. Because, as George pointed out, it happened in Massachusetts, it's happened in Rhode Island, it's happened in Connecticut. It can happen here in this blue
Absolutely.
state.
The other sad part that's happening in the state of New York is the working family party, minority party, conservative party, the liberal party, is really calling all the shots in Albany. You have Senator Craig Johnson on Long Island, Senator Foley, who are deathly afraid of the working family party. Now, the working family party was a community organized Acorn party with the unions. Basically, the unions have pushed out. Acorn basically runs that party now. They have a very radical left-wing agenda. They have a separate subsidiary of a corporation that runs political campaigns that's applied in the special election for Craig Johnson, North Shore, Long Island. They supplied 200 people going door to door, which Craig Johnson paid for. So you have a large subset of Democrats in marginal districts who are deathly afraid of the working family party, which proves a minority voice can have great power, a minority party voice, and they have an agenda. They have a series of ideas, which I don't care for, but they're winning at the moment. So
But the political dynamic here is very interesting. For the first time since 1935, the Democrats control the governorship and both houses of the legislature, and the first time since you have to go back to the 19th century sometime, that they have all of the statewide offices. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. They have absolute power, and the Working Families Party is dragging the Democratic Party to the left. There's a real vacuum there for the right message to get out, and that's why we started New Yorkers for Growth. We started it, John Faso, Liz Feld, and I, a few others, we've started it, and we did it just as a PAC to support fiscally conservative candidates for the legislature. At very modest beginnings, but we have found since the November election that there's a huge vacuum there, and we are expanding, getting issues out there on our website and things, so that there, at least there is one voice out there that not only is raising money to support candidates with the right principles, but also getting the right issues out on a website so that other people can adopt those things.
We've got a lot more questions, but believe it or not, we are at the midpoint of this hour-long program. So let's pause for a second. We're just going to go to some public service announcements, then we're going to get back to some higher education cost issues, healthcare cost issues, and other matters affecting New York's fiscal future. Stay with us, please.